Thank you so much. My name is Dominic Knoll. I'm the CEO of the World Trade Center, and I'm very happy that everyone is here today on this very exciting event. We're gonna hear later from Jack Gerard, CEO of the American Petroleum Institute, and we very much look forward to his remarks, comments, and see what's going on in this industry, as well as hopefully he can also talk a little bit about his energy report. To my right side, you see Eric Smith. He will introduce him later on. He is, besides being the assistant director with the Tulane Energy Institute, also the World Trade Center chair for our energy committee. But before we're going to start, I said I would like to say thank you to our sponsor, Petrotech, who also made this possible today, as well as I would like to tell or also mention my board, as well as my chairman, David Kearney, who's here today, and all the World Trade Center staff who made this possible. Let's give them all a round of applause. Let's talk a little bit about the energy sector. All of you are very much familiar with it, especially us here in Louisiana. The numbers show it. In 2011, we had about 287,000 jobs created here in Louisiana. That meant $74 billion in sales to local firms here. We have roughly about 12% of our whole state budget comes out from energy. 3 out of 5 of the largest refineries are here in Louisiana. As you also have seen or know, Louisiana is right now the number 2 in oil and natural gas production in the United States. So, I mean, our state really, I think we're very well involved with energy, but also on the national level, as you all know, and then, like I said, I'm just touching on it. On the national level, you probably have seen with the results are out for the first quarter of 2014 with 11 million barrels per day. The United States surpassed Saudi Arabia as well as Russia to be the largest producer for crude oil and every other hydrate. So I mean those, and if you read those statistics, it's gonna continue in that way. So we're very, very excited about that. My job is also here to talk a little bit about API and what that stands for. Also a very, very easy job because many of you are very familiar or work with them directly together. API is the lead organization in the oil and gas industry. Very old organization, founded in 1919, and currently works in oil and gas through advocacy, research, and publications. They have their hands in all kind of different areas that support the oil and gas sector, have about 550 companies, larger and mid-sized and smaller companies involved with them. And so we're very, very happy that that the CEO could be here today. Latest in the news, you probably have seen they publish several of the standards in the last couple of years under the CEO's leadership. There were probably about 500 industry standards published. Many of them have been picked up in the legislature, and I'm sure we will hear the one or other anecdote later on of some of those discussions with the government. Other things here, we also have locally 4 chapters that in case you're not a member, you should be, or you should get involved in New Orleans, Morgan City, Lake Charles, and Lafayette. And with that, I said we are very, very excited to have Jack Gerard here today with us. And I'm going to hand it over to Eric, who will go over his bio that you also find in your booklet. Thank you.
Thank you, Dominic. So it's my pleasure today to introduce Jack Gerard as President and CEO of American Petroleum Institute. That's the national trade organization for the oil and gas and really the whole energy industry, at least the portion that depends on hydrocarbons. Jack's been at API since 2008, and he's been busily expanding the membership and influence in all 50 states, not just the energy states. And globally, they now have offices in Dubai, Singapore, Beijing, and Rio de Janeiro. So it's sort of our own little mini BRIC. Their presence in Washington is quite important, and when you start looking at all of the stuff that the federal Congress has been working on, both the committees and at the level of actually trying to pass laws, you see that API is sort of omnipresent. I spent a fair amount of time in NOIA, and I'll tell you that NOIA is covering one small section of that, but NOIA is worried about offshore. These guys are worried about everything from the wellhead to the refinery to the filling station. They spend a fair amount of time worrying about public policy. They also, people tend to forget, but they also tend to set the standards for the industry, and through their recommended practices define what careful production means and what safe production means. In fact, many of the government regulations, at least all of the good ones, are actually the wholesale adoption of API recommended practices as mandated standards. Prior to joining API, Jack served as the president and CEO of another strong industry supported, the American Chemistry Council, which is all of the petrochemical players in the world, at least in the U.S. And he's also done the same thing in the mining industry. So he comes at this from a number of different directions. He's also worked as a staffer for Congress and is a graduate both in political management, I guess it is, right? And has also a Juris Doctor degree, both from George Washington, excuse me. Jack lives in Virginia with his wife, Claudette, and 8 children. So he's also been a little busy on the side there, too. It's my pleasure to introduce Jack Gerard.
Can you hear me all right in the back? Good. Thank you, Eric, and thank you, Dominic. It's a real pleasure to be here with you. As Eric mentioned, I have 8 children, so I tend to be soft-spoken on occasion, so if you can't hear me in the back, just give me the sign, preferably something that's an appropriate sign. If you, I've had a few others of those signs before, if you will. I know what those mean, too, so... But it's a great pleasure to be with you all today, and I appreciate the invitation to be down here. As I had a call from one of my chairmen on my board of directors just as I got here, and he said, "Where are you today?" And I said, "I'm in New Orleans." And he said, "What are you doing in New Orleans?" He said, "You know, it's July down there, Jack." And I said, "I know that." I said, that's kind of my luck. Northern Virginia and Washington, D.C. had a great storm blow through the last couple of days. I think, Reed, it was, 75 degrees this morning, 0 humidity. So I'm in New Orleans. But I'm thrilled to be here today, and it's always great to come back. It's one of my favorite places. And particularly when we think of Louisiana and your role in the 21st century energy renaissance, I'm thrilled to come down today and to share a few thoughts and ideas with you as we talk about. The title today is on the Shale Revolution. But what I want to focus on specifically today is on leadership and on energy leadership and what that means for us as a nation or what it means for your great state here. Now, knowing we have a lot of students in the audience today, I first want you to think about it from your literary perspective. And if we focus back on one of the great in history, Charles Dickens, you think of A Tale of Two Cities, one might characterize our thoughts or where we are today as the best of times, but the worst of times. And let me go on now and share with you some thoughts that I think will be captured in that simple idea that today, as it relates to energy in the United States, we have the best of times, but we also have the worst of times. And this comes back to that fundamental question of leadership, what we're going to do as a nation, what we're going to do as a state, and when we're going to be, where we will be as we look down the road. For many of you in the room that are younger today, as you're finishing your education, as you move out into the world, Where will you be? How will you benefit the rising generation, those children who will follow you and the generations after that? And let me suggest today we are at a key juncture. We're at a key point to where we're going to fundamentally decide that question for our nation here in the United States. The U.S. today has surpassed all expectations and achieved a level of domestic energy production that was unthinkable just 5 years ago. While we can thank the hard work and entrepreneurial spirit that made this possible, we must ensure that politicians in Washington respect the opinions of voters here in this great state and all across our nation, and work with us to ensure that our country achieves its full energy potential. What we need from our elected leaders are smart energy policies that promote our nation's position as a world leader in energy production. Think about this for just a moment. It was touched on by Dominic and Eric just a moment ago. Today, the United States is the world's #1 natural gas producer. Remember when we were talking about LNG imports just 5 or 6 short years ago? And was talked about earlier, and some believe we haven't quite yet crossed the threshold, but most believe we have, that today the United States is or will soon be the world's #1 crude producer. Now think about that. It's not Saudi Arabia, it's not Russia, it's the good old US of A that now leads the world in energy production in the areas of oil and natural gas. This change in circumstance was not due to government policy or to foresight. In fact, all too often, it has been in spite of government policies. We are a global energy leader thanks to innovation, most recently in hydraulic fracturing and horizontal drilling, and encouraged by America's unique private property interest and free market systems. Our nation's energy landscape has dramatically improved. We have gone from perceived scarcity to rich abundance. Entrepreneurs in the private sector and smart state-led policies have created and will continue to drive American energy production leadership. And no state is a better example of what good energy policy can mean than your state right here in Louisiana. For decades, Louisiana has been at the forefront of all aspects of the American energy sector. In transportation, in refining, in storage, export and import, Louisiana continues to this day as an energy leader. Today, more than 16% of your state's workforce, 412,000 total, slightly more than what Dominic had referenced earlier, is in the oil and natural gas industry, which provides $24 billion in wages to the Louisiana economy. And your state's natural gas production today accounts for only about 5% of what we do across the United States. The women and men of Louisiana have long demonstrated that developing energy resources that promote economic growth and provide well-paying, stable jobs for families need not come at the expense of the state's stunning natural beauty, your delicate ecosystems, and other natural resources. A balance that's reflected in your congressional delegation, which continues to be a steadfast voice of reason and an important ally in our effort to promote safe and effective pro-energy development policy in the nation's capital. Louisiana has the type of rational, data-driven approach to energy policy that our nation needs to fulfill its full energy potential, and sadly is all too often absent from today's national dialogue. In my view, lawmakers and regulators in Washington could learn much from your great state and the oil and natural gas industry, state regulators, Louisianans from every part of your state, and all political persuasions as we work together to create energy policies that encourage safe and responsible development, protect our fragile environment, and provide for well-paying jobs, something that we all aspire to have. Nationally, America's oil and natural gas industry supports $1.2 trillion in U.S. GDP and provides $84 million a day to the federal government in the form of taxes, royalties, bonus bids, etc. Let me re-emphasize that. If there's anyone here from the media who doubts our contribution to the economy, today the U.S. oil and gas industry contributes $84 million a day to the federal government as a direct result of a lot of the good work you do here in your state. The industry supports 9.8 million American jobs, 5.6% of our total employment in the United States. But we can do even more with the right energy policies. Further, with the right energy policies, the industry could support as many as an additional 1 million jobs here at home in 7 short years. More than 1.4 million by 2030. This includes oil and natural gas and the petrochemical industries. In Louisiana, national pro-energy development policies could result in almost 89,000 new additional jobs by 2035, which would contribute an additional $308 million in state government revenue. Yet, for reasons of political ideology, for the last several years, the federal government has shown virtually no interest in promoting new energy development on the lands and waters that it controls. And in a troubling way, opponents of energy development continue to use the tragic accident in the Gulf as an excuse to slow down, to shut down activities in federal water and on federal onshore properties. Some of you may have heard their latest rallying cry, which is to keep it in the ground. Now, as irrational and as irresponsible as that may sound, and it is to me, that is the latest mantra pushed by many who view themselves in the professional community as environmentalists, where their fundamental view in the United States today is to leave fossil fuels, be it oil, be it natural gas or coal, in the ground, not to develop these resources. Think of the impact that would have on your state here and what that would mean for our society generally, with close to 60% of the fuel used in the United States being oil and natural gas to fuel all of our domestic economy. Today, 87% of our offshore areas remain off limits to any form of exploration or development. According to the Bureau of Land Management, once again, these are governmental figures that have come out most recently, from 2008 to 2013, the number of drilling permits issued on federally controlled onshore lands have dropped by 40%. While the actual number of wells drilled, again, this is on federal land controlled by the federal government, the actual number of wells drilled has dropped by 50%, which of course further depresses production here in the United States. Most recently, a Congressional Research Service study, for those who aren't aware, the Congressional Research Service is the intellectual arm of the Congress that produces data and information on which hopefully policy decisions are made. The CRS study found that in federal areas, production from 2009 to 2013 was down 6% for crude oil and down 29% for natural gas. In contrast, and this is the important distinction I want to leave with you today as it relates to energy leadership. In contrast, on private and state lands where energy development does not need the permission of the federal government, oil production is up 59%, and natural gas production is up 33%. This difference is not due to geologic science. It is due to political science, or perhaps the dysfunctional nature of political science in our governance in the country today. Where development is possible in federal areas, permitting and leasing is a slow and cumbersome process. That's not only bad politics, it's bad policy, and it's an unnecessary drag on a still somewhat shaky economy. The fact is, expanding access could create 1 million new jobs, generate $127 billion in additional government revenue in under a decade, and dramatically increase our domestic energy production, and would place us in the United States, as I like to say, as the world's superpower in energy. Another example of bad policy is the inconsistent way that the federal government shares revenue with states that host this oil and gas development, particularly in the offshore. And those of you here in this great state know exactly what I'm talking about. Our view is that all host states should get a fair share of the revenue collected by the federal government. And as API and our involvement in public policy development, we'll continue to work with our allies in Congress on a bipartisan basis to make sure host states like Louisiana get their fair share for obvious reasons. Both are clear examples of what happens when political orthodoxy drives our energy policy and highlights the needs to get our energy policy right today to ensure that we not only take full advantage of America's vast energy resources to help meet our nation's and the world's ever-expanding need for energy, and in the process, boost our global economic competitiveness. As a side note, many of you know in the petrochemical world that today much of the manufacturing renaissance that we're talking about in the U.S. today is driven by one factor: energy policy, more specifically, the reducing cost of natural gas in the manufacturing equation. That's why we hear the announcements of many of our domestic companies and others coming home to American soil to build manufacturing capability, to employ our rising generations, etc. It's driven by energy policy as the key factor. All of which underscores our point that policy truly matters when it comes to energy. The choice before us is whether we pursue an American future of energy abundance, self-sufficiency, and global leadership, or if we step back to an era of American energy scarcity, the one we can reflect on for those who are old enough to remember back in the 1970s during the Arab oil embargo, of dependence and economic uncertainty. Our choice today for our nation is fundamentally that simple. Unfortunately, not everyone in Washington is ready to take this simple step or to make this simple choice. Where we see the Keystone Pipeline as an opportunity to bring much-needed Canadian oil to your refineries, creating jobs all along the way, some in the administration see it as a way to energize young voters who are swayed by environmental groups' misinformation campaigns. When we hear calls for higher taxes on the U.S. oil and natural gas industry or greater regulatory burden on U.S. businesses without any basis in science, we see a political agenda at work at the expense of American consumers. When EPA works to protect the interests of the ethanol industry by forcing us through the E10 blend wall, we see a challenge for all consumers who own and drive automobiles that were not built to take more than a 10% ethanol blend. And particularly here in Louisiana, we see a presidential campaign driven by politics and not by facts, science, and what's good for the overall nation. Our industry's position is politics should not drive energy policy. We will continue to work hard to counter the naysayers and will press our elected leaders for policies that support energy development, job creation, energy security, and cement our nation's place as the energy leader in the world. However, forward-looking pro-energy development policies are only half the equation. We need to ensure that the next generation of energy industry workers is ready to make the most of our nation's vast energy resource. One of the ways the oil and gas industry is leading the change we seek, and this is critically important to many of you today who are here today as students, is to ensure that our industry attracts and retains the best talent in the world from every region, every state, and every demographic group in this nation and around the world. As the number one producer of natural gas and oil today, we are looking for the best talent, the best opportunity to bring on more as we experience the great shift change or crew change. Many don't realize over the next decade in the oil and gas industry, we will likely see close to 50% of our workforce turnover. There's great opportunity in this industry today. We have just finished an analysis or a study, well, we did it about a year ago, looking to the future, looking at the demographic shifts in our society. And much of our focus has now turned to minority groups, to the African American community, to the Latino community, to women. We need them all in our workforce, and we are working diligently to give them all not only equal opportunity, but advanced opportunities as we seize the moment as a nation to become the world's energy power. Our nations are ready to take our place. Other nations are ready to take our place if we falter. The decisions our country makes in this area will chart this nation's energy course for many generations to come. Ultimately, we want to create an American consensus on energy policy that will allow our nation to take full advantage of its bright energy future. The fundamental question is whether we have the political wisdom and foresight and courage to manage our immense energy resources in a way that generates the kinds of jobs, revenue, and opportunity that have been the hallmark of our nation and our industry since the very beginning. Or will we squander this once-in-a-lifetime opportunity on the altar of political expediency and ideology? How we proceed with our game-changing energy resources will come down to the energy policies that we choose today. As I mentioned earlier, policy clearly matters. Future generations are looking to us to get our nation's energy policy right. They are counting on us to leave them a country that is second to none in energy production, security, and economic prosperity. It is our hope and expectation as we work together that we will make the right choice, and generations that will succeed us will look back at this time as a turning point and say, well done. Thank you very much for your attention. I'm happy to take some questions. Thank you.
Now we have some time for some Q&A, so please, we have some microphones around, so if when you have a question, if you could please stand up, say quick with who you're with, and make sure the question is a question. Thank you. All right, let's see.
Thank you. I read recently where there's some proposed regulations for not flaring the gas in the Balkans, and we don't have the infrastructure to transport that natural gas to the market. Will these proposed regulations impact the production of oil in the Balkan Shale area?
Well, it's a great question, and for those who know, and some are here that are very familiar with the Balkan Formation, it really is an infrastructure question. Most recently, the governor in North Dakota has come out with a new set of regulations that is tied back to the permitting process. So as we bring new production online, we're going to be required to make sure we're capturing some of that gas and we're not flaring it. So the flaring activity in the Balkan is down significantly over where it used to be, but it's going to continue to come down. But it's driven heavily by the infrastructure that's being built out there and the need to try to capture that gas now. So clearly the trend line's in the right direction. How quick can we do that? 2 years, 5 years, 10 years is not altogether clear, but you see the governor and others making it a top priority now to make sure we're not flaring that gas, but we're capturing it, bringing it to the marketplace. Here? Real loud.
Environment of surplus fossil fuel?
Well, in the some would suggest we don't have surplus fossil fuels, but let me go back to the ethanol question. Ethanol will always... There you go. Well, what's interesting, let me give you a couple facts about the corn situation today. Many don't realize that 40% of the corn crop in the United States today is now converted to fuel. And we had another press conference just yesterday. We've got a broad-based coalition that includes everybody from the environmental community to the chicken growers to the marine manufacturers. The list goes on, the motorcyclists, etc. And their biggest concern is the goal here is not to say ethanol doesn't have a role, and that's not what we say at the API. Our biggest concern right now is we've come to the point of what we call the E10 blend wall. Let me just take 30 quick seconds, where the mandates in Congress today, and this is why it comes back to policy, they got a little ahead of themselves 4 or 5 years ago, and instead of making it a percentage of the blend, they made it a mandate of volume. So we're now at a point, because demand for gasoline in the country has leveled off, and in some instances they believe it's going down due to more efficiencies, etc. And so what's happened, the volume for ethanol and these other alternatives just continues to go up. So we're now confronting the E10 blend wall, which means this year's mandate will take us through a 10% blend of ethanol. Now there's a slight problem with that, and it's called Detroit and auto manufacturers, where they have fundamentally told the Congress, if you force us through this E10 blend wall and make us put more than 10% ethanol in gasoline today, we will not honor the warranties of our cars. That's how simple this discussion is. There's 250 million vehicles on the road today in the United States. Can you imagine the impact? There's one small problem from our perspective, is guess who gets the liability for those cars if they use a fuel that impacts them? We do. So we're now back to this discussion to say the goal here is not push ethanol completely out of the equation. Some believe a slight blend of ethanol is a major enhancer, is a great benefit. We believe going long term that you'll have somewhere from probably 8 to 10% that will continue to be blended because it's the right thing to do for fuel mix, etc. But the reality is today, because of policy, we're now confronted with a challenge where the corn industry's decided they don't want to compromise on this. They just want to keep getting those volumes. Unfortunately, it's going to impact every consumer in this country in an adverse way. You ought to hear the horror stories that come out of the small engine community about people who are working in the logging industry because of the heat intensity associated with ethanol and how that chainsaw they have strapped on their belt all of a sudden engages. That's a problem. People with leaf blowers on their backs, things of this nature. So once again, we believe we got to get back to the science. There's a role for ethanol, but it's not a role that overwhelms everybody else and eventually puts a lot of consumers at risk.
Do you recognize an opportunity coming up with the retirement this year of Senator Tom Harkin of Iowa and the likely retirement of Senator Chuck Grassley in that area, given their committee status in the Senate?
Recognize it in what way? Are we watching it closely, or?
Well, obviously you're watching it closely, but do you recognize an opportunity to maybe cut back some of the power of the corn lobby?
We do, but let me just say, today, if folks voted their conscience on the House floor, we're clearly in the majority. We have well over 218 members now in the House, for example, then I'll come back to the Senate, who have indicated either outright repeal of the renewable fuel standard or significant adjustment to it. So what you see in the Senate today, led by Senator Grassley, Senator Harkin, and others, he's moving on. His heir apparent, a guy named Mr. Braley, who comes out of the House, who's a big advocate as well, they continue to have a bit of a tactical advantage because of the dysfunctional nature of the Congress. But it's my belief it's just a matter of time. And unfortunately, if people are unwilling to compromise, to develop a compromise proposal, it will likely result in what you see in a lot of these discussions, with the pendulum swinging from one extreme to the other. So instead of finding that happy medium, if you will, where we find a role for an appropriate level of ethanol, you might see this get so intense, particularly if we breach the blend wall, and then you start having auto manufacturers saying, you know, that car broke down, not on my watch. then you might see a real push real quick to just repeal it all. Our belief is that we ought to have sound science, reasoned policy. There's another element of this we shouldn't overlook, and that is that the environmental community looking at this now has concluded when you look at the life cycle of corn production in ethanol, it's actually a net carbon increase, not reduction. And so that's going to play in this broader equation as well. And so it could come to a point to where you're going to see that pendulum swing hard, and it won't matter much about the handful of Midwesterners in the corn industry, because it will just, the tide will just roll over them. That's why some of us believe we ought to get thoughtful and sit down and figure these things out from a data-driven policy perspective, and not just let the extreme politics whip us back and forth. In the back.
Briefly touched on the Keystone Pipeline. I'm specifically asking, what are the biggest restrictions that the energy industry has been fighting for the Keystone Pipeline?
What are the restrictions?
Yeah. What's the counter argument?
Irrationality, and I should be careful, shouldn't I? There's a fundamental problem with the Keystone Pipeline, and this is a good example of where politics and ideology have taken over good sound policy. We will have the 6th anniversary of an indecision on Keystone this year. That is just unacceptable. And if you want to know why private investment has to go someplace else, there's this little factor we call political risk. And it's become the greatest risk in some of these equations or in some of these decisions about where these multi-billion-dollar investments are going to take place. All we need is one simple decision with one 3-letter word, yes, by the President of the United States, and it will unleash what the State Department, their own State Department concluded, will create 42,000 American jobs. It's the largest job creator in a single project in the country today. And yet we're standing still on it because we can't make a decision. We're using, I shouldn't say we, they can't make a decision. They're using every excuse they can find. Now this comes back to policy, comes back to data, it comes back to process. There have now been 5 comprehensive environmental reviews on the Keystone XL pipeline conducted by the State Department. Every one of them have concluded the same thing. There is insignificant environmental impact as a result of this pipeline. Yet, unfortunately, it's become politicized. There are over 80 pipelines that cross that border today. Yet we want to add one more to bring more oil sands down primarily here to the Gulf of Mexico to serve this refinery sector that we're now exporting 4 million barrels a day of finished product, by the way, which is the #1 leading factor improving our trade imbalance in the United States. Yet we can't make that single decision to say yes to put another 800,000 barrels a day into a pipeline. Again, it's unacceptable. The American public today, by 78%, supports building the Keystone Pipeline. Now, you're going to hear more of it. You probably don't hear as much of it down here as we hear in key battleground states for political reasons across the country. But there's a guy named Mr. Tom Steyer, some of you have heard of, a San Francisco gentleman who made a lot of money in the oil and gas business and has now had a change of heart and single-handedly believes that's the message for climate around the world, is the Keystone Pipeline. They conveniently forget that the vast natural gas that we produce in the country today has dropped our carbon emissions into the United States to a 20-year low. The United States today leads the world in carbon emission reduction because of lower-cost natural gas, not governmental policy. We're burning more cleaner burning natural gas than we have because it's now cheaper due to the vast production that we have. So Keystone's a perfect example of what we shouldn't do in this country. So you can tell I'm a little bit passionate about this because there's lots of jobs there, there's broad bipartisan support, and this comes back to the leadership question. We need to quit playing tactical games in this country, and we need somebody to stand up and say, I'm going to lead the nation. We're now at a point, if you look at what's going on, just look at Ukraine today, look at Crimea. The United States government is currently in a trade negotiation where the Europeans are begging us to change our energy policy, to give them some stability and confidence that we can export natural gas and crude oil from the United States. We have the ability to do that, In fact, recent studies show we'd generate another 500,000 barrels a day, create thousands of new well-paying jobs as we do it. We could do that and secure our position to assist our allies around the world, and we're dilly-dallying with the decision process. Not good for the country, and that's leaving aside partisan politics. This is the fundamental choice we face. We need leadership in the country, and today it's lacking. Thank you. Thank you very much. Upset everybody.
Well, thank you so much for your remarks. I don't want to keep anyone any longer. The only two things I would want to announce is that September 26th, we will have the CEO of Whole Foods here, so please mark your calendars, as well as December 16th, we're going to have the CEO of Qantas Oil Services, who will also come to us, and we will look forward, hopefully, to have you all here back again, and thank you again for attending. Thank you.